Accidents rarely look dangerous at first. They start with a ride, a game, a show, or a place where people feel completely safe. But in the clips you're about to see, that safety disappears in seconds. In this video, a children's ride fails with a mother and her kids on board. A powerlifter collapses under 400 kilograms.
Stop.
And a ghost train fire leaves behind questions that were never fully answered. These are some of the most disturbing accidents ever caught on camera. Let's dive straight into the first clip. On September 11, 2022, a night at Diego's Park in Itanhaém, Brazil, turned into something no parent expects nor wants to witness at a children's amusement ride. The attraction looked harmless from the outside. It was a small rocket-themed drop tower, the kind of ride made for kids. Bright colors, small seats, a short lift, and just enough of a drop to feel exciting without seeming dangerous. That night, a 25-year-old mother got on the ride with her two children, one 12 years old and the other only 4. At first, everything looked normal. The seats rose up the tower, paused for a moment, and then started dropping back down. But this time, the ride did not slow down the way it was supposed to. The seats slammed hard into the bottom of the tower, throwing the mother and children violently in their restraints. For a ride that was supposed to be made for families, the impact is disturbing to watch. 1 second, it looks like a normal fairground attraction. The next, people are rushing toward the platform because something has clearly gone wrong. All 3 riders were injured and taken to hospital. The mother and her 12-year-old son were later found to have fractures in their lower backs, while the 4-year-old suffered abdominal and spinal injuries and had to remain under medical observation. Officials later said the ride failed to slow down before reaching the bottom. After the incident, the park was shut down and the area was sealed, while inspectors looked into what caused the failure. The operators claimed their maintenance records were up to date, but the incident still raised a frightening question. How can a ride built for children fail so violently in front of their own family? Thankfully, everyone survived. But the footage is still hard to watch because it shows how quickly a place designed for fun can become dangerous when the safety systems people trust do not work the way they should. And the next clip starts like something completely routine, until 1 second changes everything. On August 10, 2020, Russian powerlifter Alexander Sedek stepped onto the platform at the World Raw Powerlifting Federation Championships for what was supposed to be one of the biggest attempts of his career. Resting across his back was 400 kilograms, a weight most people could never even imagine moving, let alone squatting. But for an elite powerlifter, this was the kind of moment years of training are built around. The platform was quiet, the spotters were ready, and Sedek looked focused as he prepared to take the lift. At first, everything seemed under control. He unracked the bar cleanly, stepped back, planted his feet, and began lowering into the squat. There was no obvious warning in the first part of the movement. His body looked braced, the bar stayed steady, and for a moment it seemed like he might actually come back up with it. But at the bottom of the squat, everything failed at once. Both of his knees suddenly gave out under the weight. His legs shot forward, his body collapsed downward, and the entire lift turned into an emergency in a fraction of a second. The spotters reacted quickly and managed to control the bar before it could come down on him. But by then, the real injury had already happened. Sedek could not stand after the attempt. He had to be carried away from the platform, and once he reached the hospital, doctors realized how severe the injuries were. Both patellar tendons had ruptured, his left kneecap was fractured and displaced, and there was serious damage around both knees. After emergency surgery, he woke up to the kind of news that would change any athlete's life. Doctors told him he would have to relearn how to walk. That is what makes this accident so disturbing. It is not just the sound, the collapse, or the weight itself. It is the contrast between what he was trying to do and what happened seconds later. He walked onto that platform as one of the strongest men in the room, attempting a lift at the edge of human ability. Then, in one failed movement, He went from chasing a personal record to facing a long recovery, just to regain something most people take for granted. And that is the brutal reality of strength sports at the highest level. The body can be trained to handle incredible pressure, but when that pressure becomes too much, the failure can be instant, violent, and life-changing. But this next case feels different.
A U.S. Army veteran who lost both legs while serving in Iraq was thrown from a 200-foot-high roller coaster near Rochester, New York, and later died.
In June 2011, 29-year-old Iraq war veteran James Hackemer visited Six Flags Darien Lake with his family. James had survived a roadside bomb explosion in 2008, but the injuries had cost him both of his legs. After years of recovery, he was spending the day at the park with relatives, including his young nephew. One of the rides they approached was Ride of Steel, a 208-foot hypercoaster that reached speeds of around 73 miles per hour. The coaster used lap bars and seat belts as restraints, and its own rules stated that riders needed proper leg function to ride safely. Without legs to brace against the restraint system, the forces on that coaster could become extremely dangerous. But despite the warning signs, James was still allowed to board. Employees directed him toward the disability access area, and with help from his nephew, he was lifted into the front row. Multiple attendants saw him board, checked the restraints, and allowed the train to leave the station. At first, nothing appeared unusual. But as the coaster climbed and then came over a large hill at high speed, James's baseball cap flew off. Security footage reportedly showed him reaching upward as his upper body lifted from the seat. Because he had no lower legs to anchor against the restraint, the forces of the ride pulled him out during the drop. He struck part of the coaster structure before falling to the ground below.
And I just saw his arms go up and he just flew and he came towards me kinda.
The train returned to the platform without him, with the safety locks still engaged on the empty seat. Investigators later found that park staff had violated clear ride rules by allowing him to board. Those restrictions had not been random. They existed because restraint systems like this depend on the rider's body fitting the seat in a specific way. And on a ride moving that fast, even a locked restraint can fail to protect someone if the rider should never have been permitted on in the first place. James's children, who were only 3 and 4 years old, were waiting at the park hotel when it happened. His nephew, sitting beside him, had to witness the accident from the same coaster car. What makes this case so difficult is that it was not a hidden mechanical failure or an unpredictable break in the track. The ride operated as designed. The restraints were still locked. But the system around the ride failed before it ever left the station. A man who had already survived war came to the park for a family day out and lost his life because the rules meant to protect him were ignored. And that takes us to this next accident that was also not supposed to happen. On July 15, 2018, crowds gathered at the newly opened Askari amusement park in Karachi, Pakistan. It was the kind of night where people wanted to be among the first to try the rides. Bright lights, excited families, and a brand new attraction standing above the park. That attraction was called Discovery, a large pendulum ride designed to swing passengers high into the air. It was meant to be one of the park's biggest draws, the kind of ride that looks intimidating from the ground, but is supposed to be controlled by engineering, inspections, and safety systems. But during one of its swings, that control disappeared. At around 7:30 p.m., as the 16-seat pendulum reached nearly 40 feet in the air, witnesses heard a sudden sound that many described like an explosion. Moments later, the ride broke apart and slammed down with terrifying force. The scene that followed was chaos. Families ran toward the wreckage, people screamed for help, and park-goers tried to lift parts of the twisted structure with their bare hands. Emergency crews were called, but heavy city traffic made it difficult for them to reach the park quickly. A 12-year-old girl named Kashaf, who had reportedly been seated alone, died from her injuries. Many others were hurt, including people who suffered serious fractures and chest injuries in the collapse. Investigators later found that broken bolts and a failure involving the ride's bearing system contributed to the accident. But the deeper issue was not just one broken part. It was the lack of oversight behind the entire attraction. The Discovery ride had been imported from China and was reportedly being operated on a trial basis. But just days before the accident, the park's own director had admitted that no officials had inspected the ride because there were no clear laws requiring that kind of inspection. That detail makes the accident even more disturbing. The ride was not operating after a strict public safety review. It was running in a system where the checks that should have existed were either weak, unclear, or missing completely. After the collapse, the provincial government promised to cover medical expenses for the victims and ordered amusement park rides across the province to shut down until technical inspections could be carried out. But for Kashaf's family, that response came too late. She had gone to the park expecting a fun evening and a chance to try a new ride. Instead, her parents were left to bury their daughter only hours after she had begged for the chance to get on. And that is what makes this case so heartbreaking. The ride was new. The crowd was excited. Everything about the park was supposed to feel fresh and safe. But behind that excitement was a dangerous gap in responsibility. And once the machine failed, there was no time to undo it. And that brings us to the next case, where safety failed in a completely different way. This was Davy Lucas, and all he wanted was to go on his favorite slide. He had been visiting Diroma Aqua Park in Brazil since he was a baby, and to him, the place was familiar. It was not some unknown park or a ride he had never seen before. He knew the water attractions, he knew the layout, and more than anything, he loved the volcano slide, a 4-lane tube slide where riders climbed to the top before racing down into a shallow splash pool below. After asking his father for a long time, Davy finally got the trip he had been waiting for. His family arrived at the hotel inside the park, and soon after, his father Miranda took Davy and his younger brother to the water area. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but when they reached the attraction area, Davy told his father he needed to use the bathroom. Because he had been to the park many times before, Miranda allowed him to go alone while he stayed behind with the younger child. Minutes passed. Then more minutes passed. Davy did not come back. At first, his father waited, probably thinking his son had simply taken a little longer than expected. But when enough time passed, that waiting turned into panic. He began searching the area, not knowing that Davy had never made it to the restroom. On the way there, Davy had passed the volcano slide and decided to climb it instead. What he did not know was that the ride had been closed for maintenance. Critical pipes had been removed, parts of the structure had been dismantled, and the slide was not safe for anyone to enter. But according to Davy's parents, the access was not properly blocked off. They later said the area had only been partially closed with boards and tape, leaving enough room for a child to get inside. By the time Davy realized something was wrong, it was too late. He fell nearly 45 feet, striking part of the structure before landing below. When his father found the area, a crowd had already gathered. The sound of an ambulance echoed through the park as Davy lay motionless on the ground. Medical staff tried desperately to save him, but he later died at the hospital. After the accident, park officials claimed the ride had been completely closed and clearly marked with warning signs. But Davy's parents disputed that immediately, and investigators later confirmed that the ride had still been accessible. In the end, the park manager and the engineer responsible for the attraction were arrested and charged with manslaughter by negligence. What makes this case so heartbreaking is how ordinary it all felt at the beginning. A child at a water park, a favorite slide, a quick trip to the bathroom, a father waiting nearby, not realizing that in only a few minutes, everything had changed. And that is the disturbing part. This was not a child sneaking into some abandoned building or climbing something far away from supervision. This happened inside a public water park, around an attraction that should have been impossible to enter while it was under maintenance. And from one preventable failure, we moved to another accident that left people asking how it was ever allowed to happen. On November 13, 1982, Ray Boom Boom Mancini stepped into the ring at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas to defend his lightweight title against South Korean challenger Duke Koo Kim. To many people watching, the matchup seemed clear before it even started. Mancini was the young champion, undefeated, powerful, and already becoming one of boxing's most exciting stars. Kim was far less known to American audiences, and many expected him to be just another challenger in Mancini's rise. But from the opening bell, Kim refused to fight like someone who was only there to survive. He came forward again and again, taking heavy punches but continuing to answer back. Mancini landed clean combinations, but Kim kept pressing, absorbing punishment, and forcing the champion into a much harder fight than many had expected. As the rounds went on, both men were clearly being damaged. Mancini's face began to swell, and his hand was hurt, but Kim was taking the heavier punishment. By the later rounds, the difference became harder to ignore. Kim's face was badly marked, his movement slowed, and his body looked like it was running on willpower more than strength. Still, he refused to quit. Even after being knocked down earlier in the fight, he got back up and kept moving forward. That is part of what makes this fight so tragic. In boxing, courage is praised. Fighters are celebrated for refusing to back down. But sometimes, the same toughness that makes a fighter admired can also keep them in danger for too long. Then came round 14. Just seconds into the round, Mancini landed a sharp combination that sent Kim backward onto the canvas. He tried to pull himself up using the ropes, showing the same determination he had shown all night, but the referee stepped in and stopped the fight. At first, it looked like the end of a brutal title defense, but within moments, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Kim lost consciousness after the fight and was rushed to the hospital, where doctors discovered severe bleeding in his brain. Emergency surgery was performed, but the damage was too great. 4 days later, Duke Koo Kim died from his injuries at just 27 years old. The impact of that night reached far beyond the ring. Mancini was devastated by what had happened, and the tragedy followed him for the rest of his career. Kim's family was destroyed by the loss, and in the months that followed, his mother died by suicide. Later, the referee, Richard Green, also took his own life, with many believing the guilt from that fight weighed heavily on him.
I used to say, look, you're going to have to kill me to beat me for my title. In your heart, you fight to the death for that because that means so much to you. But it's a figurative, not literal. Trainer said he brought a coffin and put it in the room when he was training. In this sense, he said, either I'm coming home with that or Mancini's going home with that. That's scary.
The sport could not ignore what had happened. Kim's death became one of the most important turning points in boxing history, helping push championship fights away from 15 rounds and toward the 12-round format used today. And that is why this fight is still remembered as one of the most disturbing accidents ever caught on camera. It was not a freak mechanical failure or a sudden crash. It was a slow, brutal collapse happening in front of thousands of people, round after round, until the cost became impossible to undo. The question that still hangs over the fight is simple but uncomfortable. If it had been stopped earlier, would Duke Koo Kim have survived? And that brings us to another accident where the warning signs only became clear afterward. On March 24th, 2022, 14-year-old Tyre Sampson was in Orlando, Florida, on spring break with friends and teammates. He was young, happy, and by all accounts excited to take on one of the biggest rides at Icon Park, the Orlando Freefall. At the time, it was promoted as the world's tallest freestanding drop tower. Riders were lifted hundreds of feet into the air before being tilted forward and dropped toward the ground at high speed. From the outside, it was built to look extreme, the kind of ride people board because they want to feel fear in a controlled way. But for Tyre, that control was never really there. As the ride dropped, Tyre slipped out of his seat and fell more than 300 feet to the ground below. The incident happened in front of witnesses, and the video quickly spread online, shocking people around the world. Before the ride launched, some people noticed something deeply unsettling. Tyre's harness appeared to sit much higher than the others. It did not fit him the way a restraint should, and in the footage, witnesses can be heard questioning whether the seatbelt had been checked. One worker can be heard asking about the seatbelt, while another responds that the lights were on. But investigators later found that those lights did not mean Tyre was actually secure. Tyre was 6 feet 5 inches tall and weighed more than 380 pounds. The ride's manual listed a maximum rider weight of 287 pounds, and other rides had reportedly already turned him away that night. But Orlando Freefall allowed him on. The investigation later revealed why the restraint system failed so badly. Tyre's seat had been manually adjusted in a way that loosened the harness sensor. That meant the ride's safety system could be tricked into showing that the restraint was locked, even though the harness was not properly securing him. Both indicator lights showed green. But the reality was different. The worker operating the ride had reportedly only been on the job for 3 days and had been trained to trust the lights. There were no clearly posted weight limits for riders, no scale at the entrance, and no effective system in place to stop someone from boarding when the restraint did not fit safely. That is what makes this accident so disturbing. This was not a moment where a rider ignored the rules or tried to escape a restraint. Tyre sat down, trusted the ride, trusted the workers, trusted the harness, and trusted the system that was supposed to protect him. His family later sued the ride's owner, Eagle Drop Slingshot and Icon Park. A jury awarded them $310 million, and in 2023, the Freefall Tower was dismantled. Tyre's mother, Nakiah Dodd, stood there and watched as the ride was taken down piece by piece. But for his family, that could never be enough. Because the most painful part of this case is how preventable it feels. A posted weight limit, a proper restraint check, a scale, a system that could not be manipulated. Any one of those things might have stopped him from ever being placed in that seat. Instead, a 14-year-old boy boarded a ride for a few seconds of thrill and never came home. And from there, we moved to another moment that started with excitement and ended in chaos.
Fire killed 7 people, but even with dozens of former police, magistrates, witnesses and victims' families writing to the coroner, a frustrating game of buck passing has so far seen complete inaction.
Built in 1931, the Luna Park ghost train in Sydney was meant to give riders harmless scares. It was an old, dark ride, filled with painted walls, narrow tunnels, sudden turns, and the kind of low-budget horror effects that had entertained generations of visitors. But beneath that familiar attraction were risks that had already been noticed. Fire inspectors had flagged serious concerns years earlier, including the lack of sprinklers, difficult exits, and flammable materials inside the structure. Deadlines for safety upgrades were extended, but by June 9, 1979, the most important changes still had not been made. That night, a group of 4 12-year-old boys from Waverly College boarded the ghost train. Also on the ride was a father with his 2 young sons. Around 10:15 p.m., smoke began seeping from the attraction, but at first it was not treated with the urgency it deserved. Staff reportedly dismissed the smell as part of the ride's effects, and the usual attendant was not in position to properly verify what was happening. Within minutes, the situation turned catastrophic. Flames spread through the ride's timber structure, filling the tunnels with thick smoke. Some riders tried to escape by kicking through the walls, but the emergency exits were poorly marked, and the maze-like design that made the ride frightening now made it nearly impossible to navigate. By the time firefighters arrived, the structure was already burning so intensely that they could not safely enter to rescue those still inside. When the fire was finally brought under control, 7 people had died: the father, his 2 sons, and the 4 schoolboys. The official investigation never produced a fully satisfying answer. There were no sprinklers, serious safety failures, and questions about how the fire started. The coroner pointed to the possibility of a discarded cigarette, while also criticizing the park's management and the dangerous conditions inside the ride. Others later claimed they smelled accelerants or heard rumors of arson, but those claims were not properly resolved at the time. To this day, the exact cause of the Luna Park ghost train fire remains disputed.
We're now satisfied that the fire was as a result of an electrical fault within the building.
Police initially moved quickly to close the case, but many people believe the investigation left too many questions unanswered. Decades later, renewed reporting alleged that the fire may have been connected to a cover-up involving organized crime figures and land interests around the park. Former officers and witnesses later claimed that evidence had been ignored, pressure had been applied, and important leads were never fully pursued.
But as the ABC's Exposed documentary series revealed, Doug Knight, the officer in charge of the Luna Park fire investigation, was highly corrupt.
But despite all of those questions, no one was ever criminally charged for the deaths. That is what makes this case so unsettling. The ghost train was supposed to create fake fear, a controlled illusion of danger inside a seaside amusement park. But on that night, the danger became real, and the systems that should have protected the riders failed before anyone could get them out. That's all for today, folks. If you like to see more of this creepy content, click on the video on screen.